Tony Travers from the Government Department here at the LSE, I should say that. And we are now at the end, the last week of what feels like a 15-year general election campaign. Certainly the media kicked it off on the 2nd of January. It's a long way from the 3-week campaigns that we were used to. And we're going to hear today from speakers from the Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat and Green parties. And what I'm going to ask each of them to do after I've introduced them is just in 1 minute, as is traditional with these things these days, to say why they think their party's got the right answer for the country looking ahead. And then I'll invite some questions, tough as you like, boo and jeer if you want.
Oh no.
All right, or don't. Anyway, let me introduce them all one by one. Starting, I go from this side out, Sarah Ludford, who is a member of the House of Lords, a Liberal Democrat member of the House of Lords, formerly a Liberal Democrat MEP for London, one of those very large constituencies. In fact, Jenny had a large constituency when she was as a Green Assembly member for London. Previously was a councillor in Islington and is a qualified barrister. Stephen Norris is a former Conservative MP. When I first met him, he was actually an MP in Oxford and then went to Epping Forest, is that right?
Yep.
Ran for Mayor of London against Ken Livingstone, and unusually in the front ranks of modern politics has also been, sorry, I don't want to criticise everybody else, a successful business person. Third is Jenny Jones, who's a member of the House of Lords, the first ever Green member of the House of Lords. She is a member of the London Assembly, though I think this is going to be your last term at the London Assembly, and was briefly Deputy Mayor to Ken Livingstone when he was Mayor of London, and has been a leading spokesperson for the Assembly in matters to do with police, not only police obviously as a Green, but on matters of policing. And then last but not least, Andrew Adonis, who is a Labour member of the House of Lords, former senior member of the last government, wrote very elegantly about the fascinating period at the end of the government and about the complications of the last election and its aftermath, and was previously an academic and a journalist. And I, of course, once, I have to admit this, wrote a book with Andrew about the poll tax. So I've known all of these speakers for a long time. So perhaps if I can just, we didn't do lots for this, but as I've read you out that way, in terms of CVs, can I come this way, Andrew, and ask you just in a minute, I'm not going to time these minutes, but in a minute, say why you think Labour's the right place to vote.
And what they could do that's going to be better. The record of this government is poor, which is the reason why it may be only the second first-term government in a century to be voted out. It inherited a growth rate of 1.3%, it reduced that to 0 by front-ending cuts when the economy was still incredibly weak, and it's now, the latest figures show 0.3%. So its economic record is poor. Average income for the average earner is down £1,600 on 5 years ago, which is the reason why people feel, and rightly feel, a lot worse off. And in terms of the big pressing issues facing the country, £1 billion wasted on a pointless NHS reorganisation, home building, which is one of the most chronic issues facing the country, particularly in London, at its lowest level since the 1920s, and my good friends in the Lib Dems elected to scrap tuition fees, now £9,000, so a big issue, a breach of trust. What do you need from a future government? A much more balanced approach to tax and spend and growth. The Conservative plans are for very savage cuts over the next 3 years and then some pick up afterwards, with the magic money tree supposedly producing $8 billion for health. What are we doing that we will not seek to balance the budget until the end of the Parliament, which is a manageable process of fiscal consolidation that will not mean excessive cuts, and enables us through additional taxes, including the mansion tax and bankers' bonus tax and the new 50p rate, to fund a big immediate increase in NHS spending with real money, not magic money. We will significantly increase the rate of house building by significantly supporting new investment in ways that we've described, and that is essential for getting London moving and infrastructure moving. We'll be a much fairer government with the right balance between welfare reform and taxes at the top, and we will not engage in pointless reorganisations of the public services which cost huge amounts of money for little return. So, and above all, when it comes to the management of the economy and business confidence, which is going to be crucial over the next period, we will not launch the country into a completely pointless, and as is now increasingly clear, views on the doorstep, unwanted referendum on Europe that will have the whole business community plunged into chaos for 2 years. They are.
Okay, very good. It's sort of slightly inflationary minute. Well done.
Jenny,
that
you
was
can have 2 minutes. You
can have 2 minutes.
Oh, you're very generous. Thank you. I
but no more.
No more. I think Greens are the natural party for young people. Quite honestly, I was a mature student, but I did notice at the time that the majority of students weren't my age. In fact, they're mostly half my age. And I would argue that if you want a future, if you actually want a secure planet, if you want stable government, a more equal society, then actually the Green Party is the only place to put your vote. The fact is, all the other political parties are talking austerity. And they seem to be missing the point that if you don't invest in society, then you have the sort of society that nobody really wants to live in. I very much hope in the future that you are all taxpayers, and I hope that you want to pay your taxes, that you understand your taxes are actually so that you can be happy and your children can be happy and all your families can be happy. Because if you don't pay your taxes, you don't get decent public services, you don't get, for example, good public transport, you don't get a good hospital service. Paying your taxes is absolutely crucial. And so I would say the last government, but the governments before as well, have failed to understand that you don't, when you talk about public services and society, it's not enough to talk about increasing debt all the time. We all carry vast amounts of debt. It's not the debt that's unhappy, it's not being able to pay it back. And when you invest in society, you actually do get the most incredible payback. And so every pound invested in society actually gives you nearly £2.50 payback in terms of keeping people happier, keeping the economy moving, and generally having a healthy population. We would also all of our policies aim towards having a more equal society. If you have this widening gap between rich and poor, and under the Tory government, I love Stephen Norris, but under the Tory Lib Dem government, we've actually had a widening of this inequality, and that's actually bad for all of us, even those who can afford to pay our taxes. So I would say if you want to renationalise the railways, if you want good, healthy public services, and you want to save the planet, have a secure future, then the Green Party is the only place to put your vote.
Thank you very much.
Was that 2
Steve,
minutes?
That was exactly 2 minutes. Perfect. Steve.
Well, I suppose I'd have to start. It's one of the disadvantages that Andrew has is going first. So he'll have to expect me to exploit exactly that disadvantage. In the sense that, the idea that this has been, a dreadful government as far as the economy is concerned is not an idea which, for example, the IMF would necessarily agree with, or any international observer, economic observer. What they would say is that actually the UK economy is the fastest growing in the G7, that we've created 2 million new jobs since we took over from Labour in 2010. That's more jobs than the whole of the rest of the European Union put together. This is sort of rather amusing subset of that, which has created more jobs in Yorkshire than the whole of France, which, of course, Andrew's leader regards as the epitome of socialist Valhalla. And again, it's a pretty lonely position to take because nobody with a brain actually subscribes to that view. No, the economy is actually performing, thank goodness, very well. And that's one of the reasons that our current debt to GDP ratio has halved in the course of the last 5 years. We were left with a staggering difference between what government spends and what government gains from taxes to pay for that spending. What's known as, I'm sure at the LSE, it's the one place I never have to remind you, but the government's budget deficit. Now, I would love to say no to austerity, like I'd love to say no to anything that isn't particularly comfortable. I'd like a very comfortable life where I never had to worry about, what I spend because somehow the money was always there. But sadly, I'm obliged to reflect that we still spend £100 billion every year more than we raise in taxes. Now, Incidentally, that includes £60 billion, which we spend servicing the debt that we built up to allow us to live on our credit card, our great national credit card, in such an extraordinarily extravagant way. I'm afraid epitomised on any analysis by the Labour 13 years, during which we went from a balanced budget, literally a budget which was in balance, to a budget which was further in deficit than any other government in our history, ever. And these are the people who say, give us back the keys of the car, even when we wrote it off 5 years ago. No, I would just say this, that actually what we're talking about here is 2 million new jobs, really fair changes to the social security system that have last begun to get it into a fair position. So that, for example, nobody who goes out to work at 6:30 in the morning to go and drive a bus around London for 50 hours a week to earn about 35 grand is going to be worse off than somebody who simply doesn't work at all, and who simply gets the state to pay for him or her to exist. Now, nobody is suggesting that either of those sums is massive, but the huge enthusiasm that greeted that proposition was not generated by the government. It came from ordinary people who said that's the kind of fairness that we want to see, and in the process which allows us to balance a social security budget which had become completely bloated. I could go on, but all I can say is, that in this life you'll find that there are so many ways that you can look at that glass which is either half empty or half full. Andrew appears to regard the last 5 years as an economic disaster and wants you to give him the keys back so that he continue the record of taxing and spending, which so disfigured our economy that it practically was on the point of being completely bankrupt. We're not in that position now. We're repairing the damage, and frankly we need to be able to go on and do so in the future.
Thank you very much. Sarah.
Thanks very much. Liberal Democrats had to make a tough choice to go into government with the Tories in 2010. We had a democratic decision in the party to do so, and I think we've proved very resilient with all the difficulties and the accusations and criticisms thrown at us. The fact is that we did inherit an economic and financial mess in 2010, exemplified by the note left by Liam Byrne saying there is no money left. The problem is that Labour had opened the tap on public spending, and therefore when the financial crisis hit, a large part of course was a global one, although Labour had been on their prawn cocktail offensive very nice to the city and not tackled the abuses there. We were badly prepared when the taxpayers had to bail out the banks. So Labour's stewardship of the economy, I think Liberal Democrats will not take any lessons at all from Labour. The guideline that we have followed and we will continue to follow is that we want a stronger economy and a fairer society with opportunity for all. It is no accident that our party constitution, that we all feel very strongly about, says no one shall be enslaved by poverty, ignorance or conformity. We want a balanced budget. We aim to end austerity in the next 3 years, by the end of 2017-2018. The IFS have said that our budget forecasts are the most transparent. I believe that we've got a good mix of, there will have to be some spending cuts, but also higher taxes on the best off. We are committed to distributing power and making it accountable. Of course, you know all about our political constitutional reform. Unfortunately, we weren't able to make much progress with that due to Tory and Labour blockages, actually, in the last 5 years. We have been very strong on environmental matters. We have led the EU under successive energy, climate change secretaries, led the EU on setting a good target on climate change. It's not as ambitious as we would like, but we have tripled the amount of renewable energy being produced. We aim for a sustainable economy. I mean, Vince Cable started warning in 2006 under Labour that our economy was built on a bubble, on a credit and house price bubble. So we have put a lot of effort, and he is business secretary, into creating 2 million apprenticeships, into having a business bank, a green investment bank, trying to make sure that our economy actually makes things in the future rather than just lives off financial services. We are, of course, an internationalist party committed to the EU. We have been utterly consistent on that since for 70 years, and we will not be budged from that. I'll just say a word about tuition fees, as it's come up. We will take no lectures from Labour. Labour introduced tuition fees. They put up tuition fees. Ed Miliband stood for leadership in 2010 saying that he would abolish tuition fees. Their plan to reduce tuition fees to 6,000 has been judged financially illiterate and slammed by the IFS. In fact, of course, we have apologised for breaking our promise. Nick Clegg has, but as I say, the money wasn't there. And in fact, the scheme, I know you guys are, and I didn't pay any fees, so, I really feel for you, but it is effectively a graduate tax. The system is, I think the repayments are easier, the number of applications to university has actually increased, and the number from disadvantaged backgrounds has increased. So it's not great to be where we are on tuition fees, but Labour's scheme, unfortunately, will only help those who earn at least $35,000 when they start after graduation.
Okay, thank you all very much. Now, at a risk, I don't want everybody to talk again for 2 to 3 minutes, but I do think that it'd be fair to allow each of you briefly to respond, because Andrew, who did indeed go first, makes it easier to attack his and Labour's policies than everybody else who came later. So, we'll go to the same order again, but just very briefly, sort of half a minute to a minute each to respond. Andrew.
Well, the fact is, growth in 2010 was 4 times the level that it is now, and it's growth that's going to enable us to get the deficit down and to create decent jobs. 0.3% is the latest figure, 0.3% for growth, and 0.3%, and we were running at 4 times that level in 2010. So I wouldn't think that Steve's record on growth is going to be particularly impressive when it comes to creating well-paid jobs in the future. Average incomes are down very sharply on 2010. And its average incomes being sharply down, which of course is what's creating this great sense of a cost of living crisis, and the fact that most of the new jobs that have been created have been very low paid jobs or 0 hours contracts. So I don't think that there's a strong story to be said there. The Tories' future plans are deeply unbalanced, huge cuts over the next 3 years, which are almost certainly unsustainable in unprotected departments running at twice the level of the last Parliament, and only a pickup in spending at the end. So far as tuition fees are concerned, we've put a costed plan forward for a reduction to 6,000 by reducing higher level tax relief. That's not financially literate, it's just a straight trade-off, and it's not a good idea in an election if you say that you're going to end tuition fees entirely, which was the Lib Dem policy last time, end them entirely, when people expect that a coalition government at the very least will lead to compromise on essential issues, to end up by trebling them, and that's the problem that the Lib Dems have got in justifying their record.
Okay, very good. Jenny?
On tuition fees, Greens would scrap tuition fees and reintroduce student grants. And there's absolutely no point in saying this is not economically or fiscally or financially illiterate, because it absolutely is. We have superb economists in the Green Party, and I'd like to point out that the Green Party is the only political party that's always in the black. Other political parties keep dropping into the red, so we are very good with money, make no mistake. But going back to some of the things, terrible things that Steve has said, I mean, talk about financially illiterate. Talking about this growing economy when you have finite resources, what on earth is that about? How can you possibly continuously expand when you only have a limited, one planet, that's all we have, okay? And actually the resources on our planet are being diminished on a daily basis, partly by people in the West who are so consumption heavy. And of course, it's all very well to talk about jobs. It's great, 2 million jobs, fantastic, all waiting for you when you come out of education. But the fact is, of course, many of these jobs will be on low wages. They will not be on a living wage. What is the point of creating jobs that people can't live on? It's madness. So we need a living wage for every single person who works in Britain. And again, there's no point in saying this is not this is financially illiterate, because in fact, if people aren't on a living wage, they have to go on benefits, which pushes the benefits bill up. That means we're supporting non-viable businesses who won't pay people the living wage, and repairing the damage. The last government, I don't accept the Labour government either. I mean, governments have consistently made the rich-poor divide worse and worse, and this is bad for all of us. We have to repair the damage that's been done over the past 20 or 30 years. We have to make sure that people can live without falling into poverty. More and more kids in poverty, more and more people becoming homeless because they can't afford to pay their rent, they lose their jobs, they can't pay the rent. And so we have to think about a fairer society. That is the only way that we can possibly keep the planet stable.
Good, thank you. Steve?
Okay, well, I mean, just to be clear, I mean, you expand the economy, of course, because particularly in the UK, our principal export is in the services sector. Services drive our GDP growth, 80% of our GDP growth, and frankly, our intellectual capacity, is infinitely expandable, certainly in this country, and I suspect
They
globally.
still use fossil fuels.
That's why.
They still fly around the planet. They still...
Okay, intellectual capacity is actually about being able to reduce fossil fuel consumption. That's the whole point. I mean, it's about being able to live in a fair and a more equal society. But I actually kind of wanted to move the debate on, because you can get all this sort of stuff on Question Time anytime you like. I can't bear to watch it these days. Let me just therefore say a few things that I agree with. I think it's absolutely right that one of the worst features of the last 20 years, more, probably even 30, has been the widening gap between those at the top of the tree and those at the bottom. This really is a feature of the UK, rather aping the US, where the top people in business are paid massively more as a multiple of what people at the bottom of business are paid. And of course, welfare in a sense will then shadow what those at the bottom of the income profile are being paid. And I think that is a huge challenge for any government. It really is. It's a challenge for us all. And it ought to be the one thing that we all absolutely agree about. That I think you live in a much saner society, and I kind of agree with Jenny on this, where you do get that multiple down to a manageable level. I want to allow people to be rewarded by success. I think people should be rewarded by success. Entrepreneurs don't bother to take the massive risk that a new business involves. I've done it myself, unless you know that at the end you might actually get a reward out of it. If I'm not going to get any reward, then why take the risk? So if you want an economy that's growing, you need a reward culture, but perhaps not on the way that we've currently seen it. And I'm therefore, I'm in favour of us thinking creatively about how we do that. I think my problem, however, is if you just say, well, let's tax the rich. Let me make something absolutely clear. I am not against the 50p tax rate because I'm worried about bankers paying it. I'm against it because it actually demonstrably raises less money than at 45p. We now know that. It's an actual fact that we've seen before, during and after, and we know it to be the case. I think we've got to be a lot more creative. Remember that the way you get a budget back in a balance is not just to cut spending, because, of course, if you can do that, you should do it. But it's actually critically growing the big tax cake, growing the economy, so that at a given percentage of profits being taken, for government to be able to spend as taxes, you're actually getting a lot more money. If the cake is this size, you can only have a small slice. If the cake is this size, you get a much bigger slice at the same rate of tax. So, the way I want to see the economy grow is in a fairer way. It's the way that actually, Conservatives have, I think, consistently said, and certainly, over the years that I've been in Parliament, it's been our consistent ambition. The gap, as it happens, between rich and poor grew at its fastest under the last Labour government and the early years of the last Labour government under Tony Blair. Now, there are a lot of things Tony Blair did that I don't disapprove of at all, but that was a very, very worrying feature of those years where the economy raced away and this huge, huge gap actually emerged. Let me just tell you something again, just one thing about, no to austerity and the idea that you can just solve the problem of austerity by taxing rich people. Take bankers. Bankers' bonuses. I'm not a banker. I don't get a bonus. So I can say with real authority, you want to tax bankers' bonuses? Don't worry, guys. You already did. Yeah? Guy gets £1 million bonus. 450,000 of that immediately goes back to the Treasury before he even touches it. Yeah, you want to tax it a second time? Sure, go ahead. Yeah, you probably can. You get a bit more. Make it 50%. Let pay $500,000 back before he even touches it. Yeah, and then think of lots of other ways you can get that bank to say, actually, you know what? Why are we here? Why are we in London? HSBC are thinking about that now. They're saying, you know what, we could just move our corporate headquarters almost anywhere in the world. We could be in China, we could be in Hong Kong, we could be in Singapore, we could be in the US, we could be anywhere you like in the world where they simply allow us to get on with our job in a rather more favourable climate. So, you know, do you want to grow realistically or don't you? You know, I think it's a pretty obvious case, quite frankly. I'm in favour of things that work. I'm not in favour. I mean, all in favour of fine words. Fine words are magnificent, and I thoroughly applaud them. But I kind of think you need something to underpin all those fine words and turn them into action.
All of those
Okay, very good. And finally,
manifestly work. They've all been levied in the past, and they all work and they collect money. The idea that
None of them
property
work.
taxes
And what about,
don't-
None of them work.
what about a Robin Hood tax? I mean, that
You,
would actually raise a fair amount of money. And
Which is this?
you have,
Which
when
is-
you
Financial
take
transaction
0.5%,
tax.
Yeah.
take 0.5% of every financial transaction.
Oh, I don't have a problem with it. Is that?
Are you saying, Steve, it's not possible to have a higher property tax than we've got at the moment? It won't work. Is that what you were saying?
I'm
You think
saying
it's not
this,
possible to have a higher
well,
property tax.
you see,
It won't work.
the irony
It's
is,
like your proposition. You know?
Yes,
Somehow if
let
we
me tell you-
try to levy higher taxes,
Right.
they won't, we shouldn't because they
okay,
won't
just,
work.
very, just
Chairman?
answer this briefly.
Yes.
And I'll ask Sarah, and then we
Manifest.
won't
Thank
be
you.
see, I'm very happy. I'm very happy to do it.
Um,
I'm very happy to do
clearly
it
work and most other countries do them.
because on the best estimates, it raises a tiny amount of money. I mean, fine, do it. I mean, I don't think you're going to find that it's going to have a huge significant effect on
We
people
said
who
after-
own
after-
£10 million
After the
houses.
children have stopped, yeah.
just,
I mean,
just
you
carry
know,
on.
yes, I know. I mean, I
Right,
just
we'll
think
let's come back to the property tax issue.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
it's like
If you've got a
50p.
question about property tax, feel free to ask.
Sure.
Sarah.
Right,
Sorry, Sarah,
okay.
about 40p.
Yeah, I mean, our priority on tax in the last 5 years has, of course, been increasing the personal allowance. That actually was our policy for a long time before 2010. David Cameron famously said in the debates in 2010 it was unaffordable. Tories, of course, are now claiming credit for it. Fine, you know, we're a generous party. But that our ambition is to raise the threshold to 12,500. It is outrageous that anyone on minimum wage pays income tax. The Labour wants to introduce a 10p tax again. I'm very surprised they want to go back to the past. I mean, it seems to me that 10p tax, like other things they want to do, like capping rents, okay, it sounds popular, but what would you get? Maybe after 3 years, you get a massive increase in the tax. They want to freeze energy prices. I fear that there's a lot of sort of fiddling. I mean, it must be Gordon Brown-Ed balls. It's this idea of, you know, moving the deck chairs on the Titanic all the time. It's a very fiddly kind of approach, and one I think that gets lots of distortions as opposed to a rather clean and clear policy of lifting people out of tax, which benefits everybody on low and modest incomes. We have resisted some of the extreme Tory plans they want to cut the top rate to 40p. We understand that they were floating with the idea of abolishing child benefit. The Tories apparently want to find 12 billion in welfare cuts. We have no idea how they can do that, nor is the IFS, without really cutting the welfare state to the bone, so we would not be a part of that. We're the only party pledging the 8 billion extra for the NHS, which the NHS says it needs. We're also the only party that is talking about building 300,000 new homes a year, because, you know, it's all very well to look at the demand side, but the real problem, as all the housing experts saying, is the supply side. You need to build more homes, and we have various ideas for how to do that, because actually we lost 1.6 social homes in 30 years of Labour and Tory governments because Right to Buy wasn't replaced under either government. The other thing where I think Labour has lots of sort of cliff edges, whether it's on the capping rents or energy price freezes, and on the mansion tax, ours is a high property value level, which is banded. It's not the same as the council tax, but it's a similar idea of banding, because I think this problem, you'd have to have revaluations, and then everybody would argue about where there is, whereas I think with banding, there's not such a problem. So I think the whole Labour approach to this is kind of tinkering and all these kind of rigidities and distortions in the system, which I find completely unhelpful. And lastly, yes, on tuition fees, we made a promise, couldn't deliver, have apologised for that. Nick Clegg asked Miliband to apologise for the economic financial mess left in 2010. There has been no apology, nor has there ever been an apology for the illegal invasion of Iraq. And to be honest, if you ask me, I know tuition fees will forever follow the Lib Dems, but the bigger sin to me was a huge breach of international law, which we're now seeing the continuation of with IS in Iraq and Syria, was the illegal invasion of Iraq. And no apologies ever come from Tony Blair or anybody else who was in his government at the time.
Okay, right. Now I'm going to open it up to the floor. We've got just 3/4 of an hour. I'm going to ask Simon Hicks of the Government Department to ask the first question.
I'll ask about the SNP. So, 3 of the 4 of you here represent parties that campaigned against Scottish independence. Scottish Greens campaigned in favour. And part of your argument was that Scotland's a legitimate part of the Union, should be part of the Union. Scottish people are going to go out and vote for the SNP, and surely they have a legitimate opportunity to be part of the government of the UK then. So why would you not do business with the SNP and form a government with the SNP? I just don't get it. If you're a Scottish voter, I definitely wouldn't get it.
Steve Norris.
Well, you really, in a sense, have to ask Andrew about this, because the rise of the SNP is directly related to the utter failure of the Labour Party, which took Scotland for granted for generations and, has been seen through. I mean, Danny Finkelstein wrote a really good piece in the Times the other day that said you can blame the Tories for most things, but you can't blame the Tories for the rise of the SNP in Scotland, because the rise of the SNP is taking seats from Labour that Labour has taken for granted for, as I say, generations. I have no problem dealing with the SNP. I think the SNP are, first of all, a legitimate democratic party, has every right to be represented in Parliament, and if they're there with 30, 40 or 50 seats, then they'll have an important role to play. I think they've set their stall out pretty clearly. They know what they want out of the UK economy, and that's why personally I have no problem with Nicola Sturgeon saying these are the things I think that will benefit the whole of the UK. She's not saying I want independence for Scotland now and that's my red line. On the contrary, she's talking about no to austerity. Now I happen to, as you know, I think that's a wonderful fiction which will never be achieved under that government. But nonetheless, I think that's perfectly legitimate for her to play a full role. And Alex Salmond, no doubt, always been slightly worried as to which of them actually does lead the SNP, but one of the two of them will no doubt play a perfectly constructive role in the next Parliament. I don't have a problem with that at all. They've said they want to support a Labour government, but not in a formal coalition. Fine. Seems to me that's a perfectly relaxed, sensible democratic decision for them to make.
Andrew, all Labour's fault then?
I think let's say the obvious, to point out the obvious, 45% of the vote in a referendum is a disaster, but 45% of the vote in the first past the post election, all being students of government here, is a very, very strong vote indeed. And what seems to have happened, just looking at it psychologically over the last 6 months, isn't that there's been some dramatic shift of opinion away from the unionist parties, but the SNP has been able, let's see what happens next Thursday, I hope it's not the case, but has been able to consolidate that vote, which it built up in the referendum, because we have a first past the post electoral system, which it happens I don't support. Unless there is absolutely colossal tactical voting amongst the unionist parties, it is very difficult to get over that level if the SNP can hold it at 45%. However, my good friend Steve is a bit rich. I mean, let's be clear.
No, I'm very rich. Don't be ridiculous.
Part of the problem that we have in Scotland at the moment, is the extremely cavalier way that David Cameron has handled Scottish politics over the last 6 months. Remember that the appearance in front of 10 Downing Street the day after the referendum? We were all supposedly better together until 7 o'clock the following morning. We're not better together after all. We're having English votes for English laws. The Scots are being told that it's all very well for them to send representatives to Parliament, but the idea that they should actually vote in Parliament and participate in it is somehow illegitimate unless you're Conservatives. This idea that somehow it's all Labour's fault. The Conservative Party went extinct in Scotland in terms of parliamentary representation. When, Steve? I mean, let's.
They propped up a minority SNP.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not having any of that.
Why would you not go into coalition with the SNP?
Well, we've said that there isn't the basis of agreement. Let's be clear, the SNP, its manifesto, what it stands for, is Scottish independence. It doesn't want to make the institutions of the United Kingdom government work. So it's the idea, I mean, just think of it for a moment. You have a coalition government with the SNP, which is a party committed to complete independence and breaking up the United Kingdom. Just think, what posts do you give them in that government? I mean, you make them Secretary of State for Scotland so that they can then break up the United Kingdom from inside the United Kingdom government. You obviously couldn't give them defence or foreign affairs, where they wouldn't want to represent the United Kingdom, and most of the other departments are predominantly English. So you just need to think about it to see that it's not possible to do that. But they have absolutely every right to vote in Parliament. We all, apart from Jenny, fought a referendum 6 months ago defending to the death their right to vote in the United Kingdom Parliament, and I, for one, will not be party to a doctrine which now appears to be coming out of parts, not all, parts of the Conservative Party, which says it's somehow illegitimate for the Scots if they have SNP MPs to participate in the United Kingdom Parliament, which we were saying that it was in their best interests to remain in only 6 months ago.
Could I just ask Andrew, a very quick question on that? Because I know you wouldn't want to misrepresent the situation. If we were, for example, talking about changes to the education system in England and Wales, do you think it would be right that Scottish MPs of whatever political persuasion should vote on matters which don't affect them at all, but which do have an impact on people in England and Wales? Are you saying that you would be in favour of them being able to do that?
We do not have two classes of MPs in this country.
Right.
As soon as you start trying to say what issues one lot of MPs can vote on and another lot can't, it's not just Scotland you're having to deal with. Wales, there's substantial devolution there. Does Steve think that Welsh MPs should be able to vote on matters that are devolved to Wales? London. Steve and I do a lot, we're much more consensual than you might think for a moment. He and I do a lot of work together on transport issues in London. There's much higher level of devolution of transport. Basically, the whole transport budget and policy is given to TfL. Does that mean somehow that London MPs shouldn't be voting on transport issues that affect Manchester and Birmingham? I mean, this is a total nonsense. And the only place it can lead to, which is why this is so serious, the only place it can lead to is independence for Scotland. Because as soon as you start saying to the Scots that you're in the Union, but not really, we don't really want you in here, and we're going to start categorising issues, and it's very difficult to do because there's very little legislation. On Steve's point, I'm a former education minister. There's very little legislation in England only. Almost every piece of bill that's come before Parliament in my lifetime has got some issues that affect England, some England and Wales, some England, Wales and Scotland. As soon as you start going down that road, the Scots quite rightly will say, well, they don't really want us. Let's be in charge of our own destiny and let's rerun this referendum.
Okay, now Sarah, the Lib Dems are also going to lose seats, the polling suggests, to the SNP. So, not to preempt that, but I mean, what's your line on this? I mean, you're a unionist, Lib Dems are a unionist party.
Yeah.
I mean, so...
Well, I think there's a difference.
The SNP, if it came to it in some loose arrangement, perhaps just prop up a minority Labour government?
Well, Nick Clegg said not. I mean, I think there's a difference between the constitutional and the political. Okay, so constitutionally, yes, we live in the Union, and if the SNP has seats at Westminster, then they have a right to do whatever they can as regards influencing or being part of a government. That doesn't mean that we politically as a party would have to have anything to do with that, because we don't share. I mean, the SNP objective quite clearly is to break up the United Kingdom, and we don't want to help facilitate that. So Nick Clegg has said that he wouldn't do any kind of deal with Labour if it was propped up or had got a deal with the SNP. I do agree with Andrew, perhaps it's the first time I said that this session, on Cameron's extremely ill-advised statement the day after the referendum, the evil, English votes for English laws. That was highly provocative and really stupid. It's not our position. I believe, but it's true that I have forgotten to read the fine print of our manifesto on this. I think we have some suggestions for what could happen in committees at Westminster. But when it comes to the whole House, we believe that every MP's vote is equal. I mean, we are a federalist party. We would like to see a proper federal Britain. Again, this is something we've pursued for generations. I mean, we're the original Home Rule for Ireland party. So, if we had our way, we would have a problem. Because we've got a hodgepodge at the moment. It always annoys me when people in Scotland or Wales or whatever, castigate London. And for years I say, yeah, but London is oppressed by central government when the Tories abolished the City Hall. Please can you criticise Westminster and Whitehall or central government or something, not London. we're not going to have a federal Britain, a truly federal Britain in the near future. But politically, for the Lib Dems, that doesn't mean that we have to collude in furthering the SNP ambition to break up the UK. Could I just finally say that I do believe that Labour, rotten boroughs and one-party states in local government in Scotland bears a lot of the responsibility for the rise of the SNP. I think Vince Cable, who was once a Labour councillor in Glasgow, could probably tell us something about that. And it's a very good argument for proportional representation in local government to stop these appalling, rotten boroughs.
We do actually have proportional representation in Scottish local government, as it happens.
Well, you do now, but you didn't then.
Introduced by the SNP.
Okay. And Jenny, I mean, we know that the Greens were in favour of Scottish independence, and presumably would very happy to work closely, from what the leaders' debates have suggested, with the SNP or Plaid Cymru. But I mean, isn't there a risk in the longer term here that the Greens are effectively flirting with Scottish independence in a way which, if it were to happen, would actually make what I guess you want, which is a sort of green-tinged centre-left government, to be in power in the United Kingdom? You just wipe out 57, it looks as it might well be 57 left-of-centre votes, or 56 at the moment, or sort of.
Well, we do have a very sisterly relationship with the SNP and with Plaid Cymru, but let's make no mistake, I mean, we do not have identical agenda, and so everything would be by negotiation. I mean, for example, Plaid is pro-nuclear, and the Green Party is very not. Andrew, earlier when he said next Thursday, the vote next Thursday, my stomach flipped with excitement and dread and so on. I just want to say I hope you all are voting next week if you possibly can, because even if you vote for the wrong party, and I'll leave you to make up your own mind which the right one is, it's better to cast a vote than it is not to vote. And the most annoying people are those people who say, oh, I don't vote. Russell Brand. Because, you know, no vote, no voice. You know, we are deaf to you if you don't vote. But I think we should thank the SNP. We all should give a vote of thanks to the SNP, because they made politics interesting last year when they started talking about Scottish nationalism. And, you know, suddenly most of Scotland registered to vote, most of Scotland voted in that referendum, and it's made politics much more turbulent. And the Greens, in fact, can thank UKIP, because for every person that UKIP is attracted, who is attracted by UKIP, I think there must be 10 who are not, and who are looking for another political party to go to. And so the rise of the Greens, we've been calling it the Green Surge. We went from 20-something thousand members to 60,000 in the space of 12 months. I think that's due to the fact that politics is a bit more interesting. And, you know, thank goodness it is, because it's what runs your lives and runs all of our lives. And so incredibly important. We would, look, obviously, Greens would marginally rather have a Labour government in power. As far as we're concerned, this is austerity heavy, this is austerity light, or perhaps not so light. So, but we would prefer to work with the Labour government, and we could, but it would be on an issue-by-issue basis, vote by vote. We couldn't possibly go into a coalition. I think now this is definitely the new norm, this idea that you create alliances and have coalition governments. And I think that's incredibly healthy. If you look at Germany, it's been running on coalitions for decades, and, you know, it hasn't really impacted on the economy. I think it's a way of actually making politics more dynamic and allowing in more creative ideas.
Okay.
Can I just say one other thing about the
Did I
referendum?
answer-
It's
did I answer the
reinforced
question?
Don't worry.
it reinforced the case for votes at 16, which has long been Lib Dem policy, and I believe that, I hope that we will get it before too long. I think young people should have votes at 16. That would mean that politicians have to take an interest in you from 14, when you're still at school, and I think there would be a better chance of getting the voting habit when people were still at school, because we know why politicians disproportionately pay attention to pensioners, because young people don't vote. So I would actually second what Jenny said, but I hope, and I know some Tories in the House of Lords that I spoke to actually coming round to the idea of vote at 16. So miracles happen.
It is Labour in Labour's manifesto.
Yeah, Labour supported it. It's very comic, the idea that members of the House of Lords should have a view on who should be able to vote.
Yes, since we can't vote in a general election, which is another outrage.
Actually, most of the House of Lords is appointed, but some people in the House of Lords are elected, and those people are hereditaries.
Yes,
We actually vote on which hereditary lord takes their seat next.
Okay, let's take another question. I'll take one here. Let's take one here, and then we'll come to you.
Can I just raise the NHS? Because what
Wait,
seems
there's a mic. NHS.
Thank you. Kate Jenkins, LSE. The discussion about the NHS seems to me to have become focused on the £8 billion. Is there anything else that is going to be done to the NHS or about the NHS or to improve the NHS apart from stuffing £8 billion into its more again?
It can't just be given more money forever, can it? I mean, that is a real challenge for all parties and all governments. Whether it's 8 or some other number, it can't. Jenny, go on, yes, go on.
Greens want to stop the creeping privatisation of the NHS because we actually think it costs more money to privatise it. The situation we have at the moment is that nurses are very badly paid if they're employed by the NHS itself. So they actually leave and they join agencies and get paid more, and those agencies then charge colossally more to make their own profit for those nurses. So the irony is we've got the publicly paid nurses who aren't paid properly, and then agency nurses that we pay masses more. And that is the way things are going. Privatisation is always seen by many political parties as a very sensible way forward to remove the onus from the taxpayer. But actually, we end up paying more. So stop the creeping privatisation and can think more about how to make the society healthier. For example, air pollution at the moment is costing the NHS £53 billion a year, and that's only going to increase because of all the people who've got all sorts of lung disease, and it's being exacerbated by air pollution, not to mention all of the children who are developing all sorts of asthmatic conditions. They are going to be a burden on the NHS for the rest of their lives. We really have to get serious about making people healthier.
Okay, now Andrew, Labour is, without doubt, polling clear about this, compared with the Conservatives, well ahead on the NHS. However, when the last government was in power, spending on the NHS grew very, very substantially, produced results at the end, but the idea that that level of increase could ever occur again is for the birds. There's just not enough money to do it. So how would Labour, given the constraints on resources, continue to drive through what people want, which is improved standards, but without anything like the growth that occurred between 2000 and 2009?
Well, we will put in an immediate £2.5 billion, and we've said that, and that's not the magic money tree, which unfortunately Steve has to rely on for his £8 billion in 2020. That is real money coming from his taxes, which he doesn't think can be collected, but which is proved perfectly possible to collect in other countries, namely a higher property tax and a higher tax on the very wealthy. But I agree with Jenny. There's got to be a much bigger emphasis on healthy living and on preventative action when it comes to health. She mentioned air quality, which is a really big issue in London. 4,000 deaths a year now through poor air quality. It looks as if this wholesale move of transport to diesel may not be such a great idea after all, given the impact it's having on air quality standards. We need a big move towards electric transport, for example, to try and tackle that issue. Adazi's report on 6 months ago on London Health emphasised further steps to make to reduce smoking, including smoke-free parks and so on, and a big series of moves on sugar consumption, including fast food outlets and all that next to schools. So a whole set of things need to be done there. Two other things that we're committed to, of course. The one is the measure that has been waiting now for a generation to be taken, which is bringing adult social care for the elderly and the NHS together into one system. It's absolutely clear now that they need to be administered and run as a single system. What we've got at the moment is this massive problem of the elderly in hospitals with no proper support at home and support in the community, with adults' social care budgets slashed over the past 5 years because they're subject to local authority budgets, and therefore the capacity to sustain people in their homes dramatically reduced, and we need now one system. And I strongly support the move which is starting to gather pace, and I hope will generate consensus between all parties, but further devolution of budgets within the NHS, which brings together social care and NHS budgets so that the support for elderly people in their homes can be run from the same budgets as the support for elderly people in hospitals.
Can I ask a reverse question of you, Steve Norris? I mean, the present government has sustained spending, Conservative-led governments, Conservative politicians have sustained spending in real terms on the NHS, put more money in it, still trailing in the polls, way behind, well, significantly behind Labour. I mean, is there anything that the Conservatives can do to shake off the image that they are always about to undermine the NHS?
I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable question. I'm not sure there is a very easy answer to it, because this is something where, you know, I hear Labour politicians talking about saving the NHS as if anybody else was about to somehow crush it. I mean, I don't know a single member of Parliament in any party who doesn't believe that one of the greatest assets this country has got is a service which is free at the point of delivery on the basis of need rather than means. So I just want to try and answer the question about, in a sense, whether or not you can simply go on with what I think is a dreadfully lazy input-output disease. And the input-output disease is the disease which all the parties suffer from, and my party is as bad as any other, which is the assumption that the more taxpayers' money we shovel in, the better the outcomes, when that's demonstrably not the case. And just to make the point, I agree with everything that Jenny and Andrew said about getting away from being a national illness service to being a national health service, and you know therefore public education on some of these big issues, whether it's obesity, smoking, you know, cleaner air, and certainly the integration of social care into the NHS more directly. I think all of these are very good things, but I think, you know, essentially the issue that the NHS faces structurally is what faces virtually all of these huge monolith businesses. I mean, it's an extraordinary fact that the NHS is still the 5th largest corporation, entity in the world, if you exclude the People's Liberation Army and we used to say the Red Army. I'm not sure what the Red Army actually.
The biggest employer in Europe, I think.
It's the biggest employer in Europe. It's only outstripped by Indian Railways, Walmart, and I think there's one other. You know, this is kind of crazy. And what the NHS has become as an organisation is focused, as all of these organisations do, on actually the producers rather than the consumers. And now we made, in my view, I suppose I'd better use the word brave, attempt at reorganising the service. And what should have emerged from that is taking layers of unnecessary management out and putting much more control in the hands of the clinicians and the people actually delivering the care. I don't think it's been a success. And actually, I think that set us back. I really do. It was well-meaning, but I just don't think that it had the effect that it should have had. I still think that whilst I certainly wouldn't advocate that the next government of any complexion went at yet another reform of the NHS, because I think that just would, be really very harmful, in due course what we have to do is to start looking at getting rid, for example, of targets that have a counter-intuitive impact, so that you say we want to reduce waiting lists under Labour. What happened? Well, you got waiting lists to be on a waiting list and so on. If you actually want to get a more efficient and more productive NHS, you have to break free from input-output disease, and that means looking at structure.
I think that's right. I think one of the things that's bedeviled the NHS over the last 20 years, though, is obsessions with administration and organisation.
Yes. Yeah.
What bothers me, if one is looking at the NHS now, is both the complacency, that this is a wonderful national institution, because for a large proportion of people who use it, it is not. It is very poor levels of service and in some cases death.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the focus on putting money in or reorganising or restructuring, or I entirely agree with doing things about improving the quality of preventative medicine in all its shapes and forms, but we still seem to me to be extremely complacent about the quality of care that's provided by the NHS.
But, and if I may say so, that I just wanted to just say that, you know, Tony's question to me was, how do you become, you know, the party of the NHS? Well, it's certainly not by saying, actually, you know what, it's quite flawed, and a lot of people are not getting the service they want because you're right. And I think, you know, many people in this country understand that you're right, but dare any politician say that? When, you know, I would say, for example, on the privatisation issue, that where we're talking about agency nurses, that's a failure of the NHS. It's a patent failure. Do you know that the NHS is now importing agency staff who were laid off at the start of the last reorganisation and being paid? That's a failure of the NHS.
Also, of course, because they're women and it's a low-paid activity
Absolutely.
within the NHS.
Absolutely.
These are the things which are tedious internal management
right.
issues
That's
which
right.
do not get dealt with, and I think it's a pity when they're pasted over.
But beware ever saying, well, the NHS is pretty good, but it's not good enough, because that is sure as hell not a great campaigning slogan.
Sarah,
There's the irony.
Hang on, Sarah, there is this, I mean, we've just got to this nub of the point that the NHS is so difficult, partly because it is so loved, and that makes it extremely awkward for politicians to drive through improvement, forget whether it's reform, improvement, because it looks like criticising the most loved institution in the country. I mean, Liberal Democrats famously, between the two warring big parties, what's the answer? You were nodding earlier on. What is the way of sort of sorting out this
Well, part of
problem?
my nodding, I mean, I got proposals in our manifesto, but I'm also, perhaps I should declare an interest in the sense that I'm married to my husband, obviously, but I'm married to someone who is the chairman of a health trust. It's the Whittington in Archway, and they actually call themselves a health trust, not a hospital trust, because they actually got community services as well as the hospital, and so that's one of our points actually, to try and integrate, to stop the silos, to get more joined up and integrated care, whether it's GPs doing sort of more community services, these blood tests. I mean, my GP service doesn't do a blood test. I have to go off to a health centre, sit there for an hour, and blah, blah, blah. You know, it's about 2-3 hours actually to go and get a blood test. And so we need more integration there. Certainly, we would want to introduce integrate health and social care. We would put responsibility for care in the Department of Health, along with health proper, and then at local level we would encourage the pooling of budgets and consult actually on a legal duty to pool those budgets. And some things have been done at local level in boroughs, trying to bring the health and the social care together. I think some useful work has been done there, but it needs to be generalised. I certainly think the first democratic accountability for much of what happens in the NHS is the Secretary of State. And it is incredibly Stalinist as an organisation. There are millions of quangos still, as far as I can make out. I mean, be a bit careful what I say here, because, you have supposedly freedoms for a trust, but actually you've got something called the Trust Development Authority or something, which actually dictates, it seems to me, what they do. At least you've got the health and well-being boards at local level. They need to be developed, so you get at least democratic accountability at local level for the care that is commissioned. But I think that there is too much fragmentation, and there needs to be a lot more integration. We, of course, want parity for mental health, which we think has been a complete Cinderella, and could actually help perhaps save some money over the long term. I agree with everything that everybody said about air pollution. I'm absolutely delighted with the Supreme Court judgment yesterday. Yes, I certainly believe that we're open to looking at how better the NHS could work. I mean, not that we're up for another mega reorganisation. Oh my God! I mean, that was very painful. But perhaps more things that can be done within the existing constraints by fostering local work. I think in Manchester they're pooling health and social care. So there's these kind of experiments around the country which perhaps need to be shared.
Okay, lots more questions we could ask there. I want to ask for another question from the audience. Get the microphone.
Richard from LSE. So if we assume the polls are roughly right, in particular Nate Silver's analysis previously for the day, the only viable potential coalition agreement is going to be Labour SNP, which has been ruled out for politically good reasons, which means that a minority government, Labour-led, Tory-led, is the most likely. And personally, this fills me with fear, not least that almost nothing might get done, but if something does get done, well, how does that action correlate with the with the language that is used by the major parties? We agree on nothing, actually behind the scenes we have agreed on something, which is why we're doing something. It doesn't really line up. I don't think it's going to, a minority government, I don't think it's going to help the public perception of politics, one way or the other. So my question is a potentially laughable one. I'd really love a serious answer. Why isn't a Labour Conservative coalition even suggested? Why isn't it even on the table? Because there's a lot of consensus there, right? You've been mentioning it yourself, there is consensus. But you don't tell the country that there's consensus. That's the only potential avenue for a secure government. Why didn't you even suggest that?
And of course, Germany has one currently. I mean, it's not as if these things don't exist in the real world. Right, a grand coalition. I'll keep the two parties who'd be excluded from that out
Yeah,
for a
sorry
second.
for the
No,
exclusion.
we'll come back to them. Andrew, what do you are famous for being able to work with Conservatives across party lines, Michael Heseltine, Steve Norris, so you would be preeminently able to forge such a coalition, would you not?
I think there's a real democracy problem with having a grand coalition, which is what's the government afterwards? You know, the way the Westminster system works is you have two large parties, which I hope, if you've got a reasonably functioning democracy that's working well, do agree on a fair amount. There is a significant overlap. Though when the country's not doing well and hasn't been doing well over the last 6 or 7 years, quite rightly they're seeking to give their own diagnoses and in strong competition in many other areas too, and you've seen that on the economy. But if you had the two parties coming together, not only would there be a huge problem about agreeing what the programme would be and so on, but you then have Alex Salmond as leader of the opposition in House of Commons, with sitting alongside Nigel Farage and Tim Farron, who assumed to be the next leader of the Union, and that is supposed to be the alternative government that people are looking to for the election after. Just think about that for a moment and think what that leads to. So I don't think it's that's an attractive proposition. So far as minority governments are concerned, lots of other countries run perfectly well with minority governments. The reason, the issue with a minority government is whether people think it's there to stay or not. If people think that at any moment there's likely to be another election, and that therefore they've got no interest whatsoever in sustaining it or building any relationship with it or so on, then of course its life is going to be short and it's going to be voted down on most of what it does because it won't be able to generate sufficient agreement. But if people actually think, which hasn't happened in this country in the recent past, that in fact the minority government, which could be a minority coalition,
Scotland's still part of this country. It has happened in this country.
Yeah, but it has.
Scotland had a minority
it hasn't happened
government.
within Scotland. It hasn't happened. We've had no long-standing minority government in Westminster, and of course the challenge is much tougher in Westminster because you've got to agree on tax, which is the most contentious thing, and the Scots haven't really had to deal with that issue in their government so far. But if they think it's there to stay, and under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act it is harder to have an early election, then I think it would be possible to have a programme which can generate sufficient support to bring about reforms, to pass budgets, and to improve the state of the country. But I'm not pretending it's a great outcome. My own view is if we are into minority governments because neither of the major parties can get a majority, then we'd be much, much better off reforming the electoral system to a form of PR so that people wake up to the fact that that's going to continue to be the case, and therefore this gives much more stability to people's planning than continuing to think, which is what a lot of my friends in my party will think and the Conservative Party will think, which is that one more bite at the cherry and we'll turn that into a majority, which will of itself make that minority government very unstable.
Now, Steve, you are famously, the kind of Conservative who goes to the Labour Party conference and packs out rooms. Not many Conservatives who think that's true. So you, like Andrew, would be very well adapted to negotiating with and dealing with Labour MPs in a grand coalition. Would it work?
Yes, I mean, I think I'm not at all, Richard, worried about the idea of a minority government. I don't think there will be a coalition. I'm not sure, incidentally, that either the backwoodsmen in my party or in Sarah's would necessarily approve of continuing a Conservative Lib Dem coalition, even if technically we had the numbers. Because I think, the Lib Dems would feel somewhat bruised by the experience and would say now that we are established as a kind of serious party that's been in government, we will frankly reserve the right to vote on a vote-by-vote basis. So, if, for example, the whole issue of tuition fees came up, they'd simply say, no, sorry, that was in our manifesto, we're just not going to support
just be
it.
very careful
And so on.
right.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll tell you what, only two observations, not to repeat what Andrew said, most of which I agree with. Firstly, governments that do very little are wonderful governments. There's a fascinating thing. If you're in the House of Commons, I think I'm the only person here who's actually been a member of the House of Commons. If you go in the No Lobby, the whole wall, the internal wall, is covered in bookshelves which have statutes on. And when I was there, they used to start with 1900 and, on to the present day. And what's fascinating is that between 1900 to 1910 is contained on one shelf. Yeah. Next shelf is sort of 1910 to about 1917. Going down, a bit more legislation, And so, if you just follow my drift, you get to the stage where the 2013 Finance Act takes half a shelf. We legislate ourselves to death. I mean, there's an old saying in this country that hard cases make bad law. Well, we make bad law all the time. And frankly, we means this government, the coalition government, the last government, and God knows if we sat down and wrote down examples, I could give you dozens. So all I can say is that the best budget speech, which I have drafted myself, goes as follows. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I propose to make no changes whatever to any taxes or duties, and I commend this budget to the House. There would be roars of approval from business, roars of approval from ordinary people who say, at last I've got a chance to try and find out what the last one was all about. Less legislation is not necessarily a bad thing. The NHS, we've just been discussing. Answer, for God's sake, don't think that legislation would solve the problem, because it won't. Everything that Andrew was talking about, integrating social care and whatever, doesn't need legislation. So the marvellous part is that the rest of us can get on continuing to rebuild the economy while Parliament, thank God, does very little. That's the first thing. The second thing is that actually the Grand Coalition will exist. If you take, for example, you take Nicola Sturgeon's opposition to Trident, perfectly principled, perfectly reasonable that she should take that view. Ed Miliband and his party don't take that view, nor do the Conservatives. So what you will see is that she will vote against that, whether it comes up in defence spending or it comes up during the budget debate generally. And actually, you'll see the Conservatives support a minority Labour government or a minority or a Labour support a minority Conservative government on that issue. So the Grand Coalition will occasionally come together. Again, not something that particularly worries me. And you made an interesting point, which I'm not sure I agree with, which is that this would devalue the opinion that people have of politicians. And yeah. Well, you see, I think my point would be it's difficult to devalue the reputation any further than it's already fallen. But actually, I think when people could see that sensible people were getting together and making deals that actually did move the country forward, what it would actually do is to identify the backwoodsmen on both wings of the party, backwoods men and women, I suppose, who actually the people who simply won't deal with anybody, even when it's obvious that if you wanted to take the country forward, there is a middle course that could be taken. So for all these reasons, I'm actually not terribly worried. I hope, obviously, that my party gets an overall majority. I think that would be the best outcome for the country. But I'm perfectly relaxed about a minority government. I don't think you need fear it at all.
Very briefly,
well, I think we're in this uncomfortable transition from, the assumption of one-party government to a more pluralistic situation, and of course obviously the straitjacket of first past the post doesn't allow that full transition. And, you know, the understanding of the kind of compromises you have to make in a coalition, frankly, is low. People say, yeah, we expect a coalition. And then you're going to deliver all your promises, aren't you, in a coalition? Well, even if you're the biggest party in a coalition, you can't deliver everything, let alone if you're the smaller party. So I don't think the thinking has moved on, let alone, obviously, the translation into a fair voting system. The other thing I worry about, you know, the idea of a grand coalition, in Germany, I don't think that the two biggest parties have the sense of entitlement to power that Labour and Tories have traditionally in this country. They both think they've got a God-given right to rule. So if you have the two in government, I mean, God help us, you know, in terms of this kind of arrogance that you would get in government. So I don't think that we've got the system or the tradition or the history which would make that a great idea. And minority government, well, let's see, we might have to see. But you know, it doesn't have the stability that a coalition has with a coalition agreement. And actually, when I look back, the fact that we decided in 5 days in 2010 on a coalition agreement, which has delivered stable government. Okay, brickbats all over the shop, but it has delivered stable government. We have not gone down the Greek route. And frankly, I will remain extremely proud of this, even if my party takes a huge hit at the election.
No, well, that's well said.
Silly.
I wanted to come back on something that Steve just mentioned, which is the amount of legislation. And it is true that there has been some horrific legislation coming through in the past 5 years. I mean, it has been so repressive and so cruel. So, a Tory stood up.
I think I was going a bit further back than that.
Sorry. And a Tory actually stood up on the government benches and said, in the House of Lords, and said, the law we keep passing is the law of unintended consequences.
Yes, absolutely.
And that is a real problem, that foreseeing the outcome of some of this legislation is always very hard. And I take your point about the two biggest parties working together, but quite honestly, although as politicians we talk a lot, I mean, I have more in common with the other panel members than I do with any of you, simply because when you're in politics you start to understand how difficult some things are, and how you can work together and how you have to work together sometimes to make things happen. But our activists don't think like that. It is very difficult to take your party with you.
You tell them not to think like that.
Oh no, that's ridiculous. You can't tell the Green Party what to think. Green Party activists, herding cats is nothing on Green Party activists. It is just that bit harder. And in fact, Dan Hannan, a Tory MEP, chum of mine, said only yesterday to me that he tried to talk to an activist on the streets and say, look, I've got to leaflet these streets. If I take your green leaflets, will you take my Tory leaflets? He said he got an earful of abuse. But you see, politicians like us would think that was perfectly normal and perfectly acceptable.
Oh, no way.
Wouldn't you? Oh,
No
I
one
would.
trust them.
No, we used to spend
Oh,
our
really?
time taking Labour leaflets out.
Absolutely.
Well, it just shows how
When you fought
principled-
Labour in inner city boroughs,
how principled the
Very
Green
briefly,
Party
Jenny,
is.
because I want to
Can
take
I
one more
just-
short
but
break.
going back to this, it's important to listen to the language that's being used, because people are ruling out a coalition, and that is exactly what the coalition government went into. And I think they did do amazingly well to form it in 5 days. In government, in Germany, it took months to
let alone in
get...
Belgium.
Exactly. So, but a coalition's been ruled out, which I think is a very... But there is confidence to supply, which is an option, not for the Greens, but for other parties, which is when you vote for, you guarantee to vote for the budget and so on. And then, of course, an alliance. Now, an alliance is rather a formless concept, but I mean, that is the sort of thing I think we're probably going to get, not coalition.
That was I do want to go, because we need
That's
to finish
fine.
at 2. But one more, it can make it a very short question indeed, and a very short series of answers.
Okay, my name is Alcina Jeffers, and I'm running in this election as an independent, just for buying the National Health Service back for £1 single kind. Everyone in the country put £1 for it. I've already collected my phone and had my phone for the people. But the point I'm trying to say, for 7 years, we've been working on this type of thing, and no one has before listened and joined up what has been done. We now have a new system, whole system integrated care, and there's big money, all of you putting big money behind it, and I'm glad for that. But I'd like to know your views on how this is going to pan out with the NHS, because I wouldn't expect to be in a House of Parliament anyway, but I can make a little noise from this side. Thank you.
Yep.
Integrated care. Very, very briefly, just give a 1 2-word answer each, not because
Yes.
it's not important. Yes? Yes?
Unarguable.
Unarguable. Andrew, I think you said something similar.
I think the ground is the coalition that's about to appeal.
Yeah.
This is
Yes,
all in
yes.
favour.
Sarah, you're in favour of this?
Yes, I don't think I can really repeat more, do better than refer you to my previous answer.
Very good.
Sorry.
All right, no, well done.
Except it's not as
Now,
easy as it looks.
we have to have,
Yes.
we've got 1 minute to go. I'm not going to ask you a stupid question like who's going to win the election, but I would just, there's unhelpful questions at the very end. When do each of you think the next general election, after the one next week, will take place? Which year? Starting with Steve, you look as if you've got an answer.
2016.
2016. Jenny?
Do you know, you might as well ask what the cat thinks. There is absolutely no way I think anybody can predict this. I hope it's 2020.
Sarah?
2020, if there is a stable coalition again with the Liberal Democrats participating in it.
Andrew?
2020, but I don't think the whole world depends on the participation of the Lib Dems.
Okay, well, if you add those up and divide by 4, it looks like 2018. Okay, well, look, it's been a really thoughtful, interesting sort of question time, aiming for Steve's worries about the actual one. Lots of really interesting questions. If you want to grab any of the speakers now before they go, rush up immediately. And it's like, thank you all for coming at lunchtime and during the exam season as well.
Yeah, good luck on your exams.
Good luck, yes.
And,
I remember it.
Thank you all, and thank you to our excellent panel.